Bronx, New York, 1942. A man stands at the end of a production line in a one-room shop on the second floor of a building that smells like milk and sawdust. He has recently arrived from Europe. He speaks accented English. He wears a wool coat that is too heavy for the season, as though he hasn't quite accepted that he is staying. His workers, a small group, most of them immigrants like him, are filling glass jars by hand, one at a time, sealing them, setting them in rows. At peak capacity, this operation produces 648 jars per day. They will be delivered to a handful of pharmacies and hospital cafeterias in the Bronx, Brooklyn, and Manhattan. His name is Daniel Carasso. He has renamed his company Dannon because the original name, Danone, was something most Americans couldn't say. He is Jewish, French, the son of a man who built something remarkable in Barcelona and Paris, a man who named his company after his son, this son, the one now standing in the Bronx, filling jars in a country that has never heard of what he's selling. Most Americans in 1942 have never tasted what is in those jars. Many have never encountered the word on the label. The question isn't why yogurt took so long to reach America. The question is why a man fleeing a war chose to bring it here at all, and what that choice would eventually become. Before we go back to find out, drop a comment and tell us where in the world you're watching from. This story touches more countries than you'd expect, and it helps to know who's in the room. Now, further back, much further, picture a flat, sun-hammered landscape somewhere in what is now Turkey or Iraq. 7, maybe 8,000 years ago, a group of herders are doing something no human had done before in the history of the species, keeping animals alive on purpose, not to hunt them, but to use them. Goats, sheep, eventually cattle. Milk was the point. Milk is extraordinarily nutritious, dense in fat, protein, calcium. But in a warm climate, without refrigeration, milk spoils within hours. The herders knew this. They had been trying to solve this problem for a long time. The solution wasn't engineered. It was noticed. Someone stored surplus milk in a bag made from an animal's stomach. The stomach lining, even dried and cured, still harbors traces of the bacteria and enzymes the animal used in life to digest food. When warm milk meets those bacteria and sits long enough in the heat, something happens. The bacteria consume the milk's natural sugar, lactose, and produce lactic acid in its place. The acid thickens the liquid, it drops the pH. It creates an environment so hostile that most harmful organisms cannot survive in it. What comes out of that bag is not spoiled, it is transformed, tangy, thick, and safe to eat. Under conditions where plain milk would be lethal by afternoon, this lasts for days, sometimes weeks. The herders didn't understand the mechanism. There was no framework for understanding it. What they understood was simpler. The bag that had smelled like rot yesterday was something they could eat today. They ate it. They made more. This was not an invention. It was a collaboration between humans and microbes too small to see that neither side had negotiated. The bacteria didn't need humans, but humans, it turned out, needed the bacteria far more than they knew. For millennia, the relationship was entirely practical. The Roman writer Pliny the Elder noted in the 1st century AD that certain peoples he called barbarous nations had developed the art of thickening milk into a substance with an agreeable acidity. He wrote it as a curiosity. He had no explanation. He didn't think to ask for one. Nobody did. Genghis Khan's armies carried a dried, compressed, fermented milk curd called arul on campaigns that stretched from the Pacific coast to the gates of Vienna. Portable, shelf-stable, calorie-dense, the logistics of the largest land empire in history partly rested on fermented milk. The word yogurt itself doesn't appear in any written record until the 11th century in a dictionary of Turkic languages, which means that for the vast majority of its existence, 6 or 7,000 years out of 8, Yogurt had no name anyone thought worth writing down. It was just what milk became when you stored it right: ordinary, unremarkable. Then, in the autumn of 1904, it became something else entirely. The Pasteur Institute, Paris. A lecture hall packed with the city's scientific and intellectual community. The speaker wasn't scheduled to talk about food. He was Ukrainian-born, one of the most celebrated biologists in Europe, a man whose work on the immune system had earned him a reputation that would, 4 years later, win him a Nobel Prize. His name was Élie Metchnikoff, and he was consumed, with an intensity that bordered on the personal, by a single question: why do people age? Not how, why. His theory was this: the human gut harbors colonies of putrefactive bacteria, organisms that produce toxic byproducts as they break down undigested food. These toxins accumulate over a lifetime, poisoning the body slowly from within. Aging, in his framework, was not inevitable. It was a chronic condition with a biological cause, and biological causes, in principle, could be addressed. It was a controversial idea. It was also not entirely wrong. What brought yogurt into his thinking was a paper published that year by a 27-year-old Bulgarian physician named Stamen Grigorov. And the story of how Grigorov came to write that paper is the most human moment in this entire history. Grigorov had recently finished medical school in Geneva and taken a research position at the university. He was a serious scientist. He was also homesick. When he left Bulgaria, his wife packed him a clay pot of her homemade yogurt, the traditional fermented milk that Bulgarian households had been making for centuries. The pot traveled with him to Switzerland. It sat on his desk in the laboratory. At some point, Grigorov looked at it the way scientists look at things that are simply sitting there. He prepared a sample. He put it under the microscope. What he saw were bacteria, 2 distinct types, one rod-shaped, one round. They were not competing. They appeared to be cooperating, each enhancing the function of the other. Grigorov spent weeks studying them, eventually identifying the rod-shaped organism as the primary engine of fermentation. He named it Bacillus bulgaricus. It would later be renamed Lactobacillus bulgaricus. He had not set out to solve a 7,000-year-old mystery. He was homesick. His wife had packed him lunch. His paper reached Metchnikoff, who had been searching, with increasing urgency, for something that might interrupt the intestinal putrefaction he believed was killing us all. When he read Grigorov's findings, something connected. He had been watching Bulgarian peasant populations. He believed they were remarkable for their longevity, that a disproportionate number of Bulgarians lived past the age of 100. He also believed they consumed extraordinary quantities of fermented milk. The connection, to his mind, was clear. He stood in front of the Pasteur Institute and said so. The bacteria in Bulgarian yogurt, he argued, colonized the gut and drove out the organisms responsible for aging. The Bulgarians lived long because their guts were right. Their guts were right because of the yogurt. By the next morning, the newspapers had the story. In Chicago, the Daily Tribune announced that a scientist had identified sour milk as the elixir of long life. London's Pall Mall magazine asked, "Can old age be cured?" Ads in Le Figaro invited Parisians to taste the delicious Bulgarian curdled milk that the illustrious professor had recommended for suppressing the disastrous effects of old age. Shops near Parisian theaters began selling it overnight. Pharmacies stocked it before the week was out. The craze had a specific texture. It wasn't a general enthusiasm for healthy eating. It was something sharper, the feeling that a precise scientific claim had been made by a credible person about an actionable product. You could extend your life this afternoon before dinner. Physicians occasionally objected. Harvey Wiley, an American authority on food safety, added a chapter to a 1907 edition of his book, explicitly warning that excessive longevity claims about yogurt only served to bring the subject into deserved contempt. He was careful, he was measured, he was largely ignored. When Metchnikoff won the Nobel Prize in 1908, for immunology research he had done 2 decades before the yogurt lecture, work on white blood cells that had nothing to do with aging or sour milk, it didn't matter. The public didn't separate the prize from the claim. In popular understanding, the Nobel was for the yogurt. That was wrong. But it's what people believed, and belief, in a marketplace, is most of what counts. Metchnikoff himself consumed large quantities of fermented milk every day for the rest of his life. He died in 1916 at the age of 71. Give or take, the average life expectancy for an educated, well-nourished European man of his era. A quiet irony. Not yet the important one. In Barcelona, a Greek-born Sephardic Jew named Isaac Carasso was watching children suffer. Spain, in the early 20th century, was dealing with widespread digestive illness, particularly among the poor and the young. Carasso had followed Metchnikoff's work closely, with genuine belief in its implications, not merely commercial interest. He saw the situation as both a humanitarian problem and a solvable one. He went directly to the Pasteur Institute. He obtained bacterial cultures from the institute itself, which meant that every batch of yogurt he produced would carry, by direct biological lineage, the organisms Grigorov had identified in his wife's clay pot. In 1919, Carasso opened a small production facility in Barcelona. He sold his yogurt through pharmacies, not grocery stores, not markets. Pharmacies, because the distribution channel was a declaration about what he believed he was selling. He named the company after his son. Daniel, the boy, was nicknamed Dannon. The company became Danone, a father building something permanent and naming it after the person he most wanted it to outlast him. The Barcelona operation grew. Carasso established a French branch in the late 1920s. His son, Daniel, took over operations there as a young man. In a single generation, the family had built the first industrialized yogurt company in the Western world, anchored its reputation to the most prestigious scientific institution in Europe, and distributed it through the most medically credible retail channel available. Isaac Carasso died in 1939, the year the world fell apart. By 1942, the Nazis occupied France. Daniel Carasso was Jewish. He fled to New York with his business partner Joe Metzger, carrying the family formula, the Pasteur Institute cultures, and a name nobody here could say correctly. He changed it to Dannon. He set up in the Bronx. 648 cups a day, filled by hand, delivered to the pharmacies and cafeterias of immigrant neighborhoods, places where people remembered what yogurt was because they had grown up with it. The rest of New York was a harder audience. The rest of America was barely an audience at all. The problem wasn't unfamiliarity with fermented food. Americans ate sauerkraut, pickles, sourdough. The problem was this specific product's flavor. Plain yogurt is tart. Sharply, assertively tart. That tartness is the lactic acid that makes it safe. It's the essential feature. But American palates in the 1940s ran toward sweetness in a way that made plain yogurt feel, to many people, like something had gone wrong. For 5 years, Dannon sold to immigrants, to the medically adventurous, and to almost no one else. Then came 1947, and a regulatory constraint that accidentally cracked America open. American dairy laws at the time prohibited mixing dairy products with anything else. The food safety logic was sound. Manufacturers couldn't add substances to milk products without triggering a different category of oversight. But Dannon's leadership had come to understand that plain yogurt was never going to reach the mainstream on its own. The tartness was the wall. Something sweet had to be nearby. The solution was precise. A layer of strawberry fruit compote placed at the bottom of the cup, under the yogurt, not stirred in, physically separate. They argued that the fruit's low pH made the combination safe, and that the two components were not technically, combined. Regulators accepted it. The fruit was on the bottom. Strawberry first, then blueberry, then lemon. A product that had been moving a few hundred units per day in a narrow ethnic market began reaching American consumers who had never thought of themselves as yogurt eaters. The tartness was there, but sweetness was underneath. Approachable rather than challenging. The regulatory workaround of 1947 became the aesthetic identity of American yogurt for the next 6 decades. Fruit on the bottom is not a tradition. It's a legal hack that became a cultural habit. Sales grew. Daniel Carasso eventually sold the company to Beatrice Foods in 1959 and returned to Europe, where he would buy it back in 1981. Another story for another time. But before he left, a formula had been established. To sell a foreign food to Americans, you translate it through sweetness. You make it familiar enough to be approachable and foreign enough to be interesting. You lean into the health associations because Americans are intermittently drawn to the idea that what they're eating is also medicine. That last piece was about to matter more than anyone realized. Before we follow the story where it goes next, there is something that needs to be said, something the film has been holding back, because it lands differently here than it would have earlier. The entire commercial yogurt industry, the pharmacy distribution, the Pasteur Institute cultures, the refugees' factory in the Bronx, the fruit on the bottom, rests on a foundation that Metchnikoff laid in 1904. And that foundation rests on a specific empirical claim, that Bulgarians lived extraordinarily long lives because they ate fermented milk. Contemporary demographic analysis suggests that Bulgarian life expectancy at the turn of the 20th century was approximately 40 years, not 100. 40. The centenarians Metchnikoff described, the remarkable long-lived peasants whose yogurt-rich diet was supposed to explain their longevity, were likely either exaggerating their ages, as was common in rural populations with poor record-keeping, or simply not as numerous as he believed. The pattern has since been documented elsewhere: Sardinia, Okinawa, Soviet Georgia. Communities with weak civil registration systems frequently report ages that exceed what the records, when records exist, actually show. Outsiders arrive with a theory. They find the evidence they're looking for. Metchnikoff was not dishonest. He was a genuinely brilliant scientist who made a genuine observation, connected it to a genuine discovery, and drew a conclusion the data could not support. His intuition, that gut bacteria matter, that certain organisms have meaningful effects on human health, that fermented dairy products contain something useful, was not wrong. It was ahead of what the science could prove. That proof would come, but not for decades after his death. The foundation was shaky. The structure built on it turned out to be, in important ways, sound. The industry that should not have worked, built on exaggerated data, sustained by refugees, cracked open by a regulatory loophole, turned out to be pointing at something real, which is why, in 1973, when Dannon needed to save itself, they reached back for the same story. Juan Metzger, Dannon's CEO in the early 70s, faced a persistent problem. The company had not made consistent profits. It needed a repositioning strategy, something that would reach the consumers who still weren't buying. His instinct ran in a specific direction: health, longevity, real people in a real place, living to ages that Americans found remarkable. The choice fell on Soviet Georgia. More precisely, though this distinction would not be clear to the American executives involved, Abkhazia, a Soviet republic whose population had a reputation, by then well established in scientific literature, for unusual longevity. The production crew traveled there in July 1976 and filmed a series of spots. Elderly farmers. Captions with names and ages. 95, 103, 105. One commercial ended with an 89-year-old man eating Dannon yogurt, while the announcer said, His 114-year-old mother watched him fondly. The announcer said, "In Soviet Georgia, where they eat a lot of yogurt, a lot of people live past 100. These were the first American commercials ever filmed in the Soviet Union. They aired beginning in October 1976, ran through 1978, and won Clio Awards, advertising's highest recognition. Advertising Age would eventually rank the campaign among the 100 greatest of all time. After the ads began airing, Dannon reversed years of losses and became consistently profitable. The ages of the farmers were never independently verified. Dannon provided no documentation. The 114-year-old mother was never confirmed as such by any external source. This is not a minor detail. The entire campaign's logic, its reason to believe, rested on those numbers. What Dannon had done, consciously or not, was reconstruct Metchnikoff's 1904 lecture for the television age. The structure was identical: exotic people, fermented milk, implausible longevity, a camera instead of a chalkboard. The myth that launched the industry was being redeployed 70 years later, with a Cold War backdrop and a film crew behind the Iron Curtain, and it worked better the second time. Here's what makes that remarkable. By 1976, the underlying science had advanced considerably. Researchers genuinely were finding evidence that gut bacteria mattered, that lactic acid organisms interacted with the immune system in meaningful ways, that fermented dairy had measurable effects on digestive health. The science was becoming real, and yet the campaign that saved Dannon didn't rest on any of that. It rested on elderly farmers whose ages could not be confirmed, filmed in a republic that the production team couldn't correctly identify on a map. The myth was more powerful than the truth. It had always been. By 2010, the truth had caught up with the marketing. Dannon settled a class action lawsuit for $45 million over health claims made about Activia yogurt, that it could reduce the chance of getting colds or flu, that it would regulate digestion within 2 weeks. The claims were specific, they were testable, they were not supported by the available evidence. The longevity myth, having survived for over a century, had finally run into a federal judge. The industry kept growing anyway. If you found this story worth your time, this is a good moment to hit like. It helps more people find work like this. Now, back to upstate New York. 2005, Hamdi Ulukaya is 33 years old. He was born in 1972 in Erzincan, a province in eastern Turkey, in the village of Ilich. His family are Kurdish dairy farmers. He grew up making yogurt and cheese by hand, not as cultural exercise, but as daily fact. The way his family preserved milk, the way the animals and the bacteria and the kitchen and the seasons all worked together without anyone needing to explain it. He left Turkey in 1994 to study English in Pennsylvania, then enrolled at the University at Albany. He stayed. He started a small feta cheese business called Euphrates, because the Mediterranean dairy products he had grown up eating didn't exist in upstate New York, and he missed them. He is not, in 2005, thinking about transforming American food culture. A piece of junk mail arrives. A yogurt plant in New Berlin, New York, a small town in Chenango County, 4 hours north of the city, is for sale. The plant is 84 years old. Kraft Foods had built it, kept it running for decades, then shut it down. A Fortune 500 company had decided this particular facility in this particular town was no longer worth the overhead. The equipment was still inside. The building was still standing. Ulukaya drives to New Berlin. He walks through the empty factory, machinery cold and quiet. It is, in its way, a complete industrial archaeology, equipment from an era when Dannon was still perfecting the fruit-on-the-bottom format, now idle and waiting. He can see what it used to do. He can see what it could do again. He calls his lawyer. He buys the plant with a small business administration loan. He finds 5 of the former Kraft employees who had worked there and asks them to come back. He hires a master yogurt maker named Mustafa Dogan. They spend 18 months in that factory working on a recipe. What Ulukaya was making was categorically different from anything in the American yogurt aisle. The standard American yogurt of 2005, the Yoplait and Dannon products that had defined the category for decades, was thin, moderately sweet, produced in a process that retained most of the liquid whey. It was a direct descendant of the adaptation strategy Daniel Carasso had used in 1947, calibrated for American taste preferences, approachable, convenient. Ulukaya went the other direction. He strained the yogurt, a process that removed the whey, which meant that producing 1 pound of his product required approximately 3 pounds of milk. The result was dramatically thicker, much higher in protein, and far lower in sugar than anything available at a mainstream price point. It was also, in texture and flavor, much closer to what his family had made in Eastern Turkey, much closer to what yogurt had been for most of its history, before American commercial production reshaped it. He needed a name for the product. He needed a positioning concept. He chose Greek yogurt. Not because the method was Greek. Strained yogurt has been made across Turkey, the Balkans, the Middle East, and Central Asia for millennia, and his recipe came from a Kurdish dairy tradition in eastern Anatolia. He chose Greek because in the American market of 2005, Greek signaled something specific: Mediterranean, premium, health-adjacent, not threatening. He named the company Chobani. In Turkish, the word means shepherd. In October 2007, the first cups of Chobani shipped to a small kosher grocery store on Long Island. They sold out almost immediately. His distribution strategy cut against conventional wisdom in the category. He didn't target specialty grocers or health food stores, the expected launch path for an unfamiliar premium product. He went directly to the mainstream dairy aisle. Walmart, Kroger, Safeway. He priced Chobani competitively with regular yogurt, not at the premium markup that a higher-cost product would typically demand. He wanted the shopper who was reaching for Dannon or Yoplait out of habit to reach past them instead. He refused venture capital. He financed expansion through the business itself and through debt. He kept control. He kept the New Berlin plant running around the clock. He built a second facility in Idaho. By 2012, Chobani had crossed $1 billion in annual revenue. Greek yogurt, which was 1% of the American yogurt market when Chobani launched in 2007, now commanded approximately half of all yogurt dollar sales. Half the market, in 5 years, in a category that had been functionally stable for decades. The incumbents moved fast. Dannon launched Oikos. General Mills rushed a Greek line under the Yoplait brand. Both Chobani and Dannon ran Super Bowl commercials in the same year. Attack ads flew in both directions. Dannon ran spots suggesting Chobani used milk from cows treated with growth hormones. Chobani countersued. A federal judge ordered a Chobani ad pulled, ruling that a claim it had made against Dannon was, in the judge's words, literally false. The yogurt aisle had become a legal and marketing battlefield. Ulukaya won anyway. Not because his legal team was better, or his marketing budget larger. In those early years, he had neither advantage. He won because the product was right, because American consumers, confronted with something thicker, higher in protein, and lower in sugar, at a competitive price, wanted it in quantities the industry had not anticipated and could not immediately match. He did something else too. He gave his employees meaningful equity stakes in the company, a direct ownership share distributed to workers at every level. He hired refugees at scale, publicly and deliberately, becoming one of the most prominent advocates for refugee employment in American business. He committed to never selling control of Chobani. A man who arrived in the United States with approximately $3,000 built a company generating $3 billion in annual revenue by 2024, valued at $20 billion. If you want to see more stories like this one, subscribing takes about 2 seconds. And it genuinely matters for work like this. Now sit with what Ulukaya had actually done, strategically, what the nature of his bet really was. For 60 years, the American yogurt industry had operated on a single core assumption. American consumers want sweetness, convenience, and approachability. They want dairy that feels familiar. Every major commercial decision, the fruit on the bottom, the proliferation of flavors, the low-fat formulas of the 80s and 90s, served that assumption. Ulukaya looked at it and bet against it, not recklessly. He had watched American food culture shift across the decade before he launched. He had watched the slow growth of interest in protein content, clean ingredients, Mediterranean diets. He saw a gap between what the category was offering and what a segment of the market actually wanted, and concluded the gap was larger than anyone had priced in. Being right required him to make a product that, by the standards of every major player in the industry, should not have worked. Too thick, too tart, too expensive to produce, not sweet enough to win the mainstream. But his background made the bet possible. He grew up making this product. He knew what yogurt was supposed to taste like because he had tasted it that way his entire life. He didn't need market research to understand what he was aiming for. He carried it with him the way a Bulgarian doctor's wife packed a clay pot for her husband's trip to Geneva. Which brings us back to the bacteria. In 1905, Stamen Grigorov peered into a microscope at a sample from his wife's yogurt and identified a rod-shaped bacterium he called Bacillus bulgaricus. That organism, renamed Lactobacillus bulgaricus, is the same organism today that the United States Food and Drug Administration requires to be present in any product legally sold as yogurt in this country. The FDA definition specifies two bacteria, Lactobacillus bulgaricus and Streptococcus thermophilus, both identified by Grigorov, both in the pot his wife packed, both present in every cup of Chobani on every refrigerator shelf in America right now. The bacteria have been living inside human food, inside clay pots and animal skins and glass jars and plastic cups, for approximately 8,000 years. They didn't need the Pasteur Institute to validate them. They didn't need a Nobel Prize winner to endorse them or an advertising campaign filmed in Abkhazia to sell them. They didn't need a federal lawsuit or a Super Bowl commercial or a small business loan in Chenango County, New York. They were already there. Consider what it took to carry them here. Thousands of years of ordinary life, shepherds and farmers and kitchen cooks and market sellers, none of them thinking about biology, all of them passing a practice forward because it worked. Then a homesick Bulgarian with the right equipment and the right curiosity. Then a man in Paris who was brilliant and wrong and right at the same time, standing in a lecture hall, making a claim about immortality that the data likely couldn't support, pointing nonetheless at something real. Then a Greek-born Jew in Barcelona who thought sick children deserved better, and built an industry to prove it. Then his son, running for his life across the Atlantic, with a company in a suitcase, filling glass jars in the Bronx for immigrants who recognized what he was selling. Then a fruit compote placed under the yogurt because that was the only configuration the regulators would allow. Then a film crew in Abkhazia making an ad about immortality from a script Metchnikoff had essentially written 70 years earlier. Then a Kurdish farmer's son from eastern Turkey walking through a cold, empty factory in upstate New York, deciding that Americans were finally ready for the real thing. Remove any one of those moments and the chain breaks. At every critical juncture in the Western history of this food, the person who carried it forward was a foreigner, someone who knew what yogurt was supposed to be because they had grown up with it, and who bet that the place they'd landed was ready to understand. Daniel Carasso compromised. He made the yogurt sweeter and thinner because that was what the market required in 1947, and he was right. Hamdi Ulukaya refused to compromise. He made it thicker and less sweet, and trusted that the market had shifted, and he was right too. The immigrant thread runs through this story not as metaphor but as mechanism. The people who understood what was being carried were always the ones who came from somewhere else. The bacteria, of course, know none of this. They don't know about Nobel Prizes or Clio Awards or Super Bowl commercials or SBA loans. They are, in the strict biological sense, indifferent to all of it. They consume lactose. They produce lactic acid. They transform milk into something that lasts. They have been doing this, without interruption, for longer than any human institution that has ever existed. The cup of yogurt in your refrigerator is an 8,000-year-old accident that a succession of scientists, refugees, immigrants, and advertising executives spent the last century trying to explain. Most of the explanations were incomplete. Some were wrong. One of them was filmed in the Soviet Union and won an advertising award. The accident, quietly, kept working.